Hello Constant Readers, my name is Emily and welcome back to the Dark Tower Project. For today's episode, we're going to be talking about intertextuality. What is intertextuality? Intertext is the shaping of one text meaning by another text. It's the creation of an interrelationship between two texts. Recognizing moments of intertextuality can affect readers' interpretations of a text and adds depth to the meaning of a text. So there are actually three types of intertext. One is obligatory intertext. You need to get the reference to understand. Think back to The Hate You Give. The title actually comes from Tupac's lyrics. And so because the author feels that we as readers need to know that, she actually includes it in the text. So the dad is talking about how Tupac said, quote, "Thug life meant the hate you give little infants F's everybody." I censor myself. This is my daddy I'm talking to, you know. End quote. He has taken the words thug life and given them new meaning. The hate you give little infants fucks everybody. So you sort of need to get that reference. You need to get the context that we perpetuate systems of violence by doing it to the next generation, right? Like the racism that you demonstrate to small children is what keeps this fucked up system in motion. So the author knows that we need to get that intertextual reference with the title, and so she provides it for us. The second form of intertext is optional intertext. This is when it is possible but not essential to recognize a link. Doing so will give the reader a different understanding of the story. So it's like when the author is paying homage to another writer, it's a small reward for the reader to pick up on that. So for example, I strongly feel that In an Absent Dream by Seanan McGuire pays homage to C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. You don't have to be familiar with the Chronicles of Narnia, but I feel like if you are familiar with the idea of children stepping into magical worlds, you will get more out of reading Seanan McGuire's Wayward Children series, in which children fall in and out of magical worlds and have to deal with the consequences of that physically and mentally. The adjustment of moving into a secondary world and then being thrown back out into the primary world. So you don't have to get the intertext, but I think the idea of the Wayward Children works better if you are familiar with the Chronicles of Narnia. The third type of intertext is accidental. This is when readers connect two texts without any tangible anchor point. It's triggered by something in the reader's memory. It is them forming this connection that was not at all intended. And for that, I have an example of intertext for me personally that I can almost guarantee you is not intentional. So we have Animal Farm by George Orwell and Charlotte's Web by E.B. White. Both books, in my opinion, are commenting on society and valuable bodies. In Animal Farm, it brings up discussions of the good worker, 4 legs good, 2 legs bad, and even within that, certain bodies have value over other bodies. Then in Charlotte's Web, we see that Wilbur is the runt. He is not deemed valuable as meat, so they were going to kill him rather than raise him into something that wouldn't produce enough money. To keep Wilbur alive, Charlotte puts messages in the web to prove that he is exceptional, to prove that he is a worthy citizen. Again, it goes back to our discussion when we talked about fantasy, the literature of subversion. Fantasy allows us to metaphorize reality. So here in both texts, we have the fantasy of personified animals that allow us to think critically about larger social systems. So for me, these two texts always speak to each other. When I read them, they speak to each other. This is children's literature. This is like adult political fiction. They are 100% not meant to be connected. My connecting them is accidental intertextuality. I would argue that the type of intertext that we see throughout the Dark Tower series is optional. It's a reward for long-term King fans. The more familiar you are with his entire body of works, the more rewarding the sort of little Easter eggs that he's hidden throughout the Dark Tower series will be. The story still works if you don't get those references. I feel like the intertext in the Dark Tower series is also a reward for genre fans. The more familiar you are with genre tropes and characters, the more likely you are to make connections between the texts. So the reason I bring up Intertext, and I want to talk about Intertext today, is because I feel like getting the intertext is a large part of what I got out of the story. It was being familiar with some of these intertextual moments that allowed me to predict the ending of the Dark Tower series pretty early on. So I wanted to go through some of the moments of intertext now and just sort of talk about them, revisit them. So I actually started season 1 of this series by reading Childe Roland to the Dark Tower Came, which is a poem that struggles between hope and despair. And in some scholars' opinion, it is about the quest to write the poem itself. If we think about it, that the whole series is framed with Childe Roland to the Dark Tower Came, we can perhaps predict the meta nature of this text. The gunslinger as our main character is Roland of Gilead. The Roland linked with the Dark Tower is a reference to Childe Roland to the Dark Tower Came by Robert Browning, which is already a moment of intertext with William Shakespeare's King Lear, and with the fairy tale Childe Roland. Based on my exploration of the moments of intertext, I developed assumptions that I held with me throughout the rest of the Dark Tower series. That the quest to the Dark Tower series was about more than the quest. It's not the destination that's the point of the Dark Tower series. I got fairy tale rootings. All of these like juicy, meaty things were set up in the beginning, and these moments of intertext shaped my whole reading of the story. In The Wastelands, it's clearly drawing on the poem by T.S. Eliot, which again I talked about in season 1. People who are familiar with the poem know that a lot of people read it as a disillusionment with humanity post-war. We see the ugliness of humans coming out post-war. In season 1, I also talked about how that poem makes reference to the Kingfisher from Arthurian legend. So again, we're being tied. We're constantly being rooted in this Arthurian legend, this literary history. And of course, The Wasteland is an exercise in intertextuality. Like, you can read The Wasteland, and if you have a more critical reader's edition of the text, you'll get footnotes, and the footnotes will tell you, oh, this is a reference to this, and this is a reference to this, but then you can look up those texts that were made reference to, and they have history behind them as well. Like, you could just keep going down this endless spiral of footnotes trying to find the true source of this inspiration, and you never would. And I think that's kind of the point. In this way, I almost feel like the Dark Tower series is poking fun of the idea of intertextuality. Like, there's just so much there that it's like, well, have fun with that. So The Wasteland introduces the idea that literature is hope. When stories exist to be passed down and revived via intertext, like the Dark Tower series does, they achieve a certain amount of immortality. These stories never die because they exist within other stories. We get that idea of reincarnation, which goes back to my discussions on Yeats and Gyres, and we see these stories living on in new forms. And that gives us a somewhat hopeful feel. Like, I think that's framing the experience of the Dark Tower series in a hopeful way. And then of course we get Wizard and Glass, which is clearly intertextual with The Wizard of Oz, which is one of the first American fairy tales. We've already talked about how fairy tales are important for relaying culture and morals. Like, fairy tales are cultural productions, so that what is considered one of the first American fairy tales, The Wizard of Oz, that is incorporated into the Dark Tower series, which is this American fantasy, I think is really important. It's really key to pay attention to. Like, what are we supposed to get out of The Wizard of Oz? What sorts of messages? Like, and I mean, if you think about it, it works. You've got the wizard, you've got the Tin Man, you've got the Scarecrow, fairy tale things happen in threes, you've got Dorothy, and like, they each have a fatal flaw that they ask to have filled, right? Like, the Wizard of Oz is very formulaic in terms of it being a fairy tale, right? And I think the messaging that comes out of that about what is important, I would argue believing in yourself, like having faith in your own abilities and trust in your family, like that all expresses very American sentiments. If we think of what American literature and the American dream might be, right? Wolves of the Kala, I think, draws on Yeats' Second Coming. That is a really important moment of intertext that really, really shapes where I think you can predict the story will go. The idea of gyres, the idea of reincarnation. I've talked so much about that in season 1 of this, but I think it's important because getting that moment of intertext takes away perhaps the shock and absolute devastation of encountering the ending of the Dark Tower series. We get that Roland is this character archetype doomed to be repeated in narrative. We also learn in that book that Callahan is fictional in Salem's Lot, and so there's that moment of intertext with Salem's Lot. If you haven't read Salem's Lot, which I hadn't at the time, I mean, the book still functions, but I think knowing who Father Callahan is, sort of having seen him in Salem's Lot, seen that background, only serves to enrich the world. So again, that's a moment of optional intertext that I think it's worth seeking out that reference. Then we have Song of Susanna. We have references to Arthurian legend with the baby being named Mordred. So in Arthurian legend, Mordred always kills Arthur. It was then my prediction that Mordred would kill his father Roland because Arthur is Mordred's father. Mordred always kills Arthur. So Roland, being Mordred's father, would probably end up being killed by Mordred. That was my prediction. That's what that moment of intertext set up. And then it is in Song of Susanna that we get the quote, "We've been haunted by books," end quote, which I think is a clear reference to all of these moments of intertext. The Dark Tower series is shaped and informed by moments of intertext. And then the Dark Tower, of course, brings it all home. We have links to Stephen King's It, and we encounter this version of Pennywise in a fairy tale gingerbread house in the winter woods. It's a trap, and we know it's a trap because we know that the fairy tale gingerbread house in Hansel and Gretel is a trap. It's this beautiful, sugary, wonderful candy house to draw in the weary travelers so that the monster inside can eat you. And like, if you're familiar with fairy tales, you know that the person that you encounter inside a gingerbread house is going to eat you. They are bad news. The more you've read, the more you get out of that moment. We have the Harry Potter sneeches. I literally have no idea what to do with that. I had that on my list of videos that I wanted to make originally to talk about the moments of intertext with Harry Potter, and I tried to puzzle around that, what it means to have this children's plaything from a popular fantasy text become weaponized in the Dark Tower series. I tried to sort of like noodle that and nothing ever came of it. And then in the end, we learn that Roland is doomed to repeat his narrative over and over again, which is the destiny of every single fictional character. Frodo is doomed to repeat his journey to the mountain to destroy the ring. Wilbur is doomed to repeat the narrative of his life always being on the chopping block and losing his best friend Fern and Charlotte dying, because the character is literally confined between the covers. Their narrative is solidified. It's in print, it's down in ink, it's on paper. It's not changing. It's not a choose your own adventure novel, right? All of this intertext, in my opinion, is to get us to understand the complex and layered experience of being a reader. Every time we reread a story, we bring new intertext. We bring new optional or accidental intertext. The more you read, the more experience you have, the more you bring to each text every time you read it, every time you reread it. We allow our first reading of the text to shape our second reading of the text. The first time you read the Dark Tower series and you didn't know what the ending was, you probably had different expectations than when you started the text a second time back at the beginning. Maybe at that point you'd read more Stephen King novels and you pick up another reference, right? The series, the Dark Tower series, ultimately doesn't need a satisfying climax, in my opinion, because in my opinion, the purpose of the series is the journey. It is the exercise of reading. It is the exercise of making connections, of thinking critically, of asking questions. But that's just my opinion. What do you guys think? What does intertextuality do for you as a reader? What moments of intertext have you picked up on while reading the Dark Tower series? I would love to hear from you guys in the comments down below. So before we go, we have to thank my patrons. Thank you, patrons, for making videos like this possible. I really appreciate the work that you are enabling me to do. If you're interested in becoming a patron and supporting all the work that has gone into this series over the years, and to support the making of future projects, links to the Patreon page will be in the description box down below. So that brings us to the end of this video today. I really enjoy moments of intertext. I think they're fun. I think that they are enriching. And I think finding those moments is another way in which we can think critically, especially if it's intentional. If the author is doing something intentional, if they're saying something, if they're subverting something, that can be so much fun to think about and to ask questions about. I really, really enjoy finding these little treats, like going on a treasure hunt in a book. Thank you guys so much for watching, and until next time, long days and pleasant nights.